In the summer of 1945, the world was a landscape scarred by 6 years of relentless war. Cities across Europe and Asia bore the marks of devastation, nations were exhausted, and millions had perished. The conflict that had begun as a regional struggle had expanded into a global catastrophe. In Europe, Germany had surrendered in May, leaving the continent to pick through the ruins and rebuild from the ashes of blitzkrieg, bombings, and occupation. Yet in the Pacific, the war raged on, claiming lives with unrelenting ferocity. Japan, despite facing mounting losses and a crippling blockade, remained determined to resist. Its soldiers, fueled by a sense of national pride and duty, fortified islands, cities, and ports in preparation for a final desperate defense. The Allied powers, particularly the United States, faced a difficult decision. Conventional warfare had proven costly, and the Japanese military showed no sign of surrendering unconditionally. The United States had already launched a series of devastating campaigns across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, capturing islands with immense casualties on both sides. Yet each victory seemed to harden Japan's resolve, and intelligence reports suggested that a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and potentially millions of Japanese lives. Amid this grim calculus, a new unprecedented weapon offered a different path: the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project, a secret initiative involving some of the greatest scientific minds of the era, had been underway for 3 years. Led by physicists such as Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, and Richard Feynman, the project sought to harness the power of nuclear fission to create a weapon of unimaginable force. At remote laboratories in New Mexico, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, scientists worked tirelessly, often unaware of the full scope of their efforts, driven by urgency, curiosity, and a shadow of fear. By July 1945, the project had reached its climax with the successful detonation of the first nuclear device at the Trinity test site in the New Mexico desert. The explosion illuminated the night sky with a brilliant flash, followed by a mushroom cloud that stretched miles into the atmosphere, a terrifying preview of what was to come. Meanwhile, in Japan, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Cities were reduced to rubble from conventional bombings. Food shortages plagued civilians, and morale wavered under the strain of continuous air raids. Hiroshima, a bustling city of nearly 350,000 people, served as both a military hub and a regional center of culture and commerce. Its dense population and strategic importance made it a focal point in America's calculations. Yet for the people living there, life continued amidst the uncertainty. Parents tended to children, shopkeepers opened their stores, and workers went about daily routines, unaware that the world above them had changed irreversibly. The decision to use the atomic bomb was not taken lightly. President Harry S. Truman and his advisors faced an agonizing moral dilemma. On one hand, conventional invasion promised staggering casualties. On the other, the bomb promised immediate and decisive impact, but at the cost of thousands of civilian lives. Military leaders argued that demonstration alone might be insufficient to compel surrender. Advisors debated targeting industrial or military installations versus population centers. Ultimately, the choice fell to Hiroshima a city whose geography and infrastructure made it an ideal test of the bomb's destructive capability. In the days leading up to August 6th, preparations moved swiftly. Scientists and engineers ensured the bomb's assembly and delivery were flawless, while military crews rehearsed every detail of the mission. On the ground, airmen loaded supplies and reviewed navigational charts, unaware that the world's first nuclear strike would soon be theirs to carry out. Civilians, meanwhile, went about their routines. Children played in sunlit streets, vendors sold goods at bustling markets, and families shared evening meals, all under the looming shadow of a war they could not escape. The tension was palpable, though invisible. For the people of Hiroshima, life followed a fragile rhythm punctuated by air raid warnings and blackout drills, a constant reminder that destruction could come at any moment. For the men and women in the United States military, each day was defined by preparation, secrecy, and anticipation. As the bomb was transported, checked, and armed, the reality of its power was beginning to crystallize in the minds of those who had created it. They understood that what they held was no ordinary weapon. It was a force that could reduce a city to ash in seconds, a technology that could reshape the very fabric of human history. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the stage was set. The Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber, waited on the runway, engines humming, its crew tense yet resolute. Above them, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, carrying with it the promise of devastation and the weight of an entire world's anxieties. Below, Hiroshima lay unaware, the city humming with life, its streets busy, its people unaware that their lives and the lives of tens of thousands were about to change forever. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, had been meticulously prepared. Scientists had debated every aspect of its construction, its detonation mechanism, its potential yield. Military strategists had calculated the expected damage, the radius of destruction, and the likely casualties. Yet even as every detail was planned, uncertainty lingered. No one could truly comprehend the scale of destruction that nuclear energy would unleash upon an urban centre. And so, as the Enola Gay prepared for takeoff, the world held its breath, poised on the edge of a terrifying new era. As the plane ascended into the morning sky, the city of Hiroshima went about its day, children heading to school, workers walking to factories, families opening shops. The ordinary life of a city unaware of the extraordinary event about to strike it, carried on with quiet resilience. Somewhere above, the bomb, a product of human ingenuity and ambition, waited for the moment it would change everything. And as the Enola Gay climbed higher, its course set for destiny, the world teetered between the end of one war and the dawn of an era that would redefine the meaning of human power, morality, and survival. In the moments before the bomb's release, silence and tension filled the air, a pause heavy with the weight of history. And then the crew readied the bomb, checked the instruments, and prepared for the final command. The city below, unaware and alive with daily life, was about to face the unimaginable. Then, as the city woke beneath the morning sun, the Enola Gay approached its target. The crew, a mix of anticipation, nerves, and duty, followed protocols they had rehearsed countless times. The bomber flew high above Hiroshima at an altitude that rendered the streets, buildings, and people below almost miniature in scale. To the pilots and bombardiers, the city looked serene, yet that tranquility belied the unimaginable destruction about to unfold. Inside the plane, instruments were checked, dials adjusted, and final coordinates confirmed. The bomb, little boy, sat poised in the bay, a product of scientific genius and human ambition, now on the verge of unleashing a force the world had never witnessed. The crew exchanged few words. Each understood the gravity of the moment. Every heartbeat echoed with the weight of history. Below, Hiroshima carried on as it had for countless mornings. Workers hurried to factories, children laughed and ran toward schools. Vendors arranged their wares for the day's trade. The streets lined with wooden buildings, schools, hospitals and homes were alive with the rhythms of ordinary life. Few had the faintest awareness of the catastrophe descending upon them. The city, with its rivers and bridges, hills and neighborhoods, was poised unknowingly on the threshold of annihilation. At precisely 8:15 a.m., over the heart of the city, the bomb bay doors opened. The bombardier released little boy. For a brief suspended moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The bomb fell, slicing silently through the sky, a ticking herald of devastation. Then came the explosion. A blinding flash erupted across the city, brighter than 1,000 suns. In an instant, the city's streets, homes and workplaces were engulfed in a searing light. The air became fire. Shadows were burned into walls and pavement, and buildings disintegrated into clouds of smoke and ash. The shockwave followed, ripping through the city with an unstoppable force, toppling structures and hurling debris across streets and rivers. The roar was unlike anything human ears had ever heard, a sound that shook the very earth. People in Hiroshima experienced the horror in countless, unspeakable ways. Survivors later described the sensation as walking through a furnace, being swept by a force that left nothing familiar in its wake. Those closest to the epicenter vanished instantly, leaving only impressions of their forms behind, frozen in the blinding light. Fires ignited across the city, consuming wooden buildings and flammable materials, merging with the heat of the blast to create a firestorm that turned neighborhoods into smoldering ruins. Medical facilities were overwhelmed almost immediately. Hospitals, already strained by wartime conditions, were destroyed along with much of the city, leaving the injured without care. Survivors struggled to rescue friends, family, and neighbors, often with their own bodies burned and bleeding. Children cried for parents who had vanished. Parents searched desperately for children who would never be found. The air itself seemed poisoned, carrying dust, ash, and radioactive particles that would linger for decades, silently affecting those who survived. The scale of the destruction defied comprehension. Tens of thousands perished within seconds. Tens of thousands more were wounded or irradiated. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Landmarks that had stood for centuries crumbled. For those who lived, the city they had known vanished in a blinding, instantaneous fury. Yet even amidst this chaos, human courage and resilience emerged. Survivors helped one another, guided the wounded, and sought shelter amid the ruins, often carrying the injured through streets still ablaze, navigating debris-strewn paths, and attempting to save lives in conditions that seemed utterly impossible. Meanwhile, the Enola Gay's crew observed from above, recording the event with instruments and photographs, noting damage patterns, and documenting the bomb's unprecedented impact. From their vantage point, Hiroshima looked like a landscape transformed by fire and wind, a city reduced to shadows and smoke. The enormity of what they had done was immediate, undeniable, and chilling. In the hours following the detonation, the human toll began to emerge in fragments of testimony. Survivors spoke of sudden blindness from the flash, ears ringing from the shock wave, skin peeling from intense heat, and lungs scorched by the firestorm. Hospitals overflowed with injured civilians, many beyond the help of medical intervention. Radiation sickness, though invisible at first, began claiming lives in the days and weeks that followed, leaving survivors weak, vomiting, and vulnerable to infection. The Japanese government and military struggled to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe. Initial reports described massive destruction in the city centre, but the true scope, over 70,000 dead immediately and tens of thousands more to follow, was staggering. Citizens, desperate for news of missing relatives, faced a landscape of rubble, fire, and silence. Communications were disrupted. Hospitals and public services were crippled. The city, once a hub of culture, commerce, and daily life, had been transformed into a vast wasteland in less than a minute. Yet amidst the devastation, threads of humanity endured. Stories emerged of individuals who, despite suffering burns, injuries, or loss, carried children to safety, shared water and food with neighbors, and comforted the dying. The human instinct to help, to survive, and to protect one another persisted even in the shadow of annihilation. As night fell over Hiroshima, the scale of the horror became clearer. Fires continued to burn across the city, smoke rising in thick columns against the darkening sky. Survivors wandered the streets, searching for shelter, loved ones, and answers. Emergency services, where they could operate, attempted to treat the injured and contain the fires. The city that had greeted the morning with routine life now faced an unimaginable reality, a silence broken only by cries for help, the roar of flames, and the distant echoes of the bomb's destructive force. Globally, news of the bombing began to spread. Governments, scientists, and military leaders grasped that a new era had begun, one in which humanity possessed the ability to annihilate entire cities instantly. The political, ethical, and strategic ramifications were immediate. In Japan, leaders confronted the harrowing choice of surrender or continued resistance, aware that a second strike could be imminent. Around the world, the atomic bomb became a symbol of ultimate power, a harbinger of a future in which warfare could no longer be measured by conventional means. By the end of the first day, Hiroshima lay in ruins. Streets were impassable, buildings obliterated, and thousands counted among the dead. Survivors huddled in temporary shelters, tending to the wounded and mourning the loss of friends, family, and neighbors. The human spirit began to emerge. Small acts of kindness, resourcefulness, and endurance illuminated the darkness, signaling that life, though scarred, persisted. And as the sun set over the ruined city, Japanese officials faced an agonizing realization: Hiroshima was only the beginning. Reports from reconnaissance flights confirmed the scale of destruction, and the military understood that their nation had been struck by a weapon of unprecedented force. At the same time, planners in the United States prepared for the next step, anticipating the possible need for a second demonstration to compel surrender. The survivors of Hiroshima would carry the scars for a lifetime. Visible and invisible burns, blindness, and shattered limbs would mark their bodies. Radiation sickness, chronic illness, and psychological trauma would mark their minds. Families were torn apart, communities obliterated, and a generation confronted with a new and terrifying reality. Yet even amid the devastation, stories of courage, survival, and human resilience began to take shape, offering glimmers of hope and a testament to the enduring will to live. And so, as the world watched in horror and awe, Japan faced an impossible decision. Would surrender come swiftly, or would resistance persist, inviting further destruction? Above, the skies remained calm, belying the violence that had unfolded below. In the silence, the echoes of the bomb, both literal and metaphorical, resonated, signaling that humanity had entered a new age, one in which the very tools of civilization could be turned into instruments of unparalleled destruction. And then, in the days that followed, as reports and images filtered through, the world braced for the inevitable next chapter, Nagasaki. Then, as Hiroshima struggled to recover from the unprecedented devastation, the survivors faced a reality more harrowing than most could have imagined. The city that had once thrived with daily life, commerce, and laughter was now a landscape of ash and ruin. Streets were unrecognizable, rivers choked with debris, and buildings that had once stood tall were reduced to skeletal frames or scattered rubble. For those who had survived the initial blast, the challenge was not only survival but understanding the scope of what had occurred. In the immediate aftermath, the air was thick with smoke, dust, and the lingering poison of radiation. People wandered through the streets, searching for family members, neighbors, and friends. Some dragged the injured to improvised shelters. Others sought water and food, though both were scarce. Hospitals that had survived the blast were overwhelmed beyond capacity, and medical supplies were nearly non-existent. Makeshift clinics were established wherever possible, often staffed by survivors themselves, many of whom were too injured to help effectively. The cries of the wounded and dying echoed through the ruins, a haunting soundtrack to a city that had been instantaneously transformed into a nightmare. Radiation sickness, initially mysterious, began to claim lives in the days following the bombing. Survivors experienced nausea, hair loss, fever, and severe fatigue. The invisible threat of radiation added a layer of terror beyond the obvious destruction. Families who had escaped the immediate blast still faced the gradual, insidious effects of exposure. Children developed burns and lesions that would not heal properly. Adults fell ill with fevers and hemorrhaging. Hospitals struggled to diagnose or treat these symptoms, as the scientific understanding of radiation's effects was limited at the time. The city became a living laboratory of suffering, each story a testament to the unforeseen consequences of nuclear power. Amid this chaos, the human instinct to survive and to help others became a quiet beacon. Survivors carried friends and family members through rubble-strewn streets. They built makeshift shelters from wooden beams and tatters of clothing. Strangers shared meager supplies of food and water, forming temporary communities of care and resilience. The sheer scale of loss did not entirely extinguish humanity. Rather, it revealed an extraordinary capacity for endurance and compassion, even under the most extreme circumstances. The Japanese government faced an equally overwhelming challenge. Military and civilian officials worked tirelessly to assess the damage, report casualties, and determine next steps. Communications were difficult. Telegraphs, telephones, and roads had been destroyed, and officials struggled to piece together a coherent picture of the catastrophe. Reports from Hiroshima described devastation that was almost unimaginable. Tens of thousands dead, hospitals and infrastructure destroyed, and survivors left to navigate a city that no longer existed in the form they had known. The government recognized that this event was unlike any prior military engagement. It was not merely a defeat on the battlefield, but an existential threat to the very fabric of the nation. Globally, the news of Hiroshima's destruction spread rapidly. Governments, scientists, and military strategists recognized that a new age had begun. The atomic bomb was not just another weapon, it was an instrument capable of ending entire cities in minutes. World leaders grappled with the implications. Diplomats debated the morality of using such power. Military strategists considered the tactical advantages and future potential. The atomic age had arrived, forcing humanity to confront its own capacity for annihilation. In the midst of this chaos, personal stories of loss and resilience emerged. Survivors recounted the moment of the blast, the blinding light, the searing heat, and the unimaginable force that had upended their lives. Children described being thrown to the ground, blinded, and burned. Parents spoke of frantically searching for their children among the ruins, only to find shadows imprinted on walls or streets, silent markers of those lost in an instant. These stories, though deeply tragic, became enduring testimonies of human suffering and survival, illustrating both the horror of the bomb and the strength of the human spirit. Reconstruction efforts were nearly impossible in the immediate aftermath. Essential resources, food, water, and medical care were in short supply, and the sheer scale of destruction overwhelmed any organized response. Survivors scavenged what they could, creating temporary shelters, digging through rubble for loved ones, and attempting to restore even a semblance of normalcy. Many relied on community networks, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers supporting strangers, forging bonds in the crucible of shared trauma. As the city struggled to comprehend the full extent of the devastation, attention began to shift toward the potential for additional strikes. The United States, having observed the results of Hiroshima, prepared for the possibility that a second bomb might be necessary to compel Japan's surrender. Reconnaissance flights reported the overwhelming scale of destruction, and military planners calculated the likelihood of continued resistance. The psychological impact on Japanese leaders was profound. The reality of the atomic bomb had introduced a new level of fear and urgency that no conventional weapon could achieve. In Hiroshima, the human toll continued to rise. Days turned into weeks, and the effects of radiation, combined with injuries and disease, claimed tens of thousands more lives. Families were fractured, communities decimated, and the infrastructure of the city nearly obliterated. Yet even as despair loomed, survivors began to adapt. Makeshift schools were established, religious ceremonies continued in improvised spaces, and efforts to clear debris and restore basic services began. Life, though altered, irreparably persisted. The bombing of Hiroshima also prompted international reflection. News agencies, diplomats, and scientists debated the ethical and moral implications of deploying such a weapon. Questions arose. Could humanity wield such power responsibly? Was the destruction justified by the goal of ending the war? What precedent did the use of nuclear weapons set for future generations? These questions would resonate for decades, shaping the global discourse on warfare, ethics, and human responsibility. By the end of the first week after the bombing, Hiroshima had become both a cautionary tale and a symbol. The city's ruins illustrated the power of technology when combined with human intent, revealing the terrifying potential of nuclear weapons. At the same time, the resilience of its survivors highlighted the enduring capacity of humanity to adapt, endure, and rebuild, even in the face of overwhelming destruction. And as the world absorbed the reality of Hiroshima, a second city, Nagasaki, unknowingly faced the same imminent fate. Japanese leaders, already grappling with the unprecedented devastation, understood that another strike could occur at any moment. Civilians in Nagasaki continued their daily lives, unaware that they too would soon experience the full force of atomic power. The aftermath of Hiroshima thus set the stage for both immediate military decisions and long-term reflection. It forced Japan, the United States, and the world to confront the terrifying capabilities of nuclear energy, and it left an indelible mark on global consciousness, a reminder of the consequences of wielding power on a scale never before imaginable. And then, as Hiroshima struggled to recover, a second city braced unknowingly for the arrival of another bomb. Then, on the morning of August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki awoke under an ordinary sun, its streets bustling with commerce and daily routines. Vendors set up stalls along narrow lanes, children hurried to school, and factory workers began their shifts. Life, as it often does in times of conflict, carried on with a fragile normalcy. Unbeknownst to the citizens, a force far beyond ordinary human imagination was about to descend, repeating the horror that Hiroshima had already endured. Nagasaki, a city of roughly 250,000 people, was a vital industrial hub for Japan. Its shipyards, factories, and military supply centers made it strategically important, yet it also held dense residential areas filled with civilians going about their daily lives. The city's hilly terrain, rivers, and bridges gave it a unique landscape, one that would both shape and complicate the destruction to come. Residents, like those in Hiroshima, had no warning that a second atomic strike was imminent. The morning air carried the scents of cooking fires, freshly baked bread, and the dew of summer ordinary smells that belied the extraordinary catastrophe about to unfold. High above the city, the B-29 bomber boxcar carried its deadly cargo, the plutonium-based bomb known as Fat Man. The crew, trained and aware of the consequences, prepared meticulously. Instruments were calibrated, altitude confirmed, and the bomb's release mechanisms checked multiple times. Every member of the crew understood the enormity of their task. They were about to repeat history, delivering a weapon whose power was unlike anything humanity had previously witnessed. As the plane approached Nagasaki, the sun glinted off rooftops and rivers, casting shadows across the streets, Children laughed, unaware that moments later their world would be consumed by unimaginable heat and destruction. Factory whistles blew, signaling shift changes. Merchants called out greetings to passing customers. The ordinary rhythms of a city would soon collide with forces of extraordinary violence. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man was released from the bomber, falling silently through the sky. For the people below, there was no warning, no sound, no tremor, only the inevitability of fate descending from above. Then, in an instant, the bomb detonated over the city, unleashing a blinding flash and a searing fireball. The explosion was more powerful than Hiroshima's. Fueled by the bomb's plutonium core, buildings were obliterated, concrete, steel, and wood alike were reduced to rubble. The blast wave spread with devastating speed, shattering windows, toppling walls, and hurling debris through the streets. Survivors later described the scene as if the sun itself had fallen upon the city. Heat-scorched skin set fires across neighborhoods and ignited a chain reaction that engulfed structures in flames. Those near the epicenter were vaporized instantly, leaving only faint shadows burned into the ground. Others suffered horrific injuries, burns, lacerations, broken bones, and trauma from collapsing buildings. Hospitals and medical facilities, already strained from wartime shortages, were overwhelmed beyond capacity. Emergency responders and civilians alike struggled to assist the injured, often while suffering injuries themselves. Radiation, invisible and insidious, began its silent work. Those who survived the initial blast found themselves weakened, vomiting, and feverish. Over the following days, radiation sickness claimed more lives, compounding the devastation wrought by the explosion itself. Children, pregnant women, and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, and many perished despite the efforts of surviving medical personnel. The long-term effects, cancer, infertility, chronic illness, would haunt the survivors for decades, a legacy of invisible suffering. The city's hilly terrain created a complex pattern of destruction. Some neighborhoods were completely flattened, while others were partially spared by the undulating landscape. Rivers carried debris and the remains of structures, and fires spread unpredictably, fueled by gusts of wind and the sheer intensity of the heat. Bridges collapsed, cutting off routes of escape, and the smoke from the fires darkened the sky, casting an eerie pall over the ruined city. Families were torn apart. Parents searched desperately for children. Siblings called out for one another amidst the chaos. Friends and neighbors sought to reunite. Some survivors were trapped under rubble, listening to the cries of loved ones before succumbing to injuries or radiation sick. Others wandered aimlessly, covered in ash, burned, and disoriented, seeking shelter and aid in a city where nearly every building had been compromised. Military and government officials in Japan were confronted with the harsh reality that surrender might be the only way to prevent further destruction. The realization that two cities had been obliterated by a weapon beyond conventional comprehension sent shockwaves through leadership. Debates intensified about whether continued resistance was feasible, as the scale of the devastation demonstrated that Japan's industrial and urban centers could no longer withstand such attacks. Meanwhile, international reaction was swift. Governments and military strategists across the globe recognized that the atomic bomb was no longer an abstract concept but a tangible, horrifying reality. The power to annihilate entire cities instantaneously had become a strategic tool and a moral dilemma on a scale never before imagined. Discussions about the ethics of using such a weapon, the potential for future arms races, and the responsibility of nations in controlling nuclear technology began in earnest, laying the groundwork for decades of geopolitical tension. Survivor accounts from Nagasaki revealed stories of extraordinary courage and resilience. Individuals dragged the injured to safety, provided comfort to the dying, and sought to salvage what little remained. Children guided parents to shelter. Strangers shared food and water despite the scarcity. Communities formed spontaneously amid the ruins, united by the necessity of survival. Even in the face of near total destruction, the human instinct to help one another persisted, highlighting the endurance of compassion alongside the horrors of the bomb. By the end of the day, Nagasaki lay in ruins, echoing the devastation of Hiroshima just 3 days prior. Tens of thousands had died instantly, with countless others wounded or irradiated. The scale of destruction, combined with the psychological shock, forced Japan's leaders to confront the unthinkable. The nation had encountered a power beyond conventional warfare, one that could destroy its cities at will. In the aftermath, families grieved, communities mourned, and survivors began the slow, painful process of recovery. Hospitals struggled to treat the wounded, temporary shelters were established where possible, and aid workers attempted to provide some semblance of relief. The city's survivors bore not only physical scars but emotional ones, trauma, loss, and the haunting memory of a day when life as they knew it had been erased in a single instant. Globally, the bombing of Nagasaki cemented the dawn of the nuclear age. Diplomats, scientists, and military leaders recognized that humanity now possessed the power to obliterate itself in minutes. Ethical debates intensified. Was the use of atomic bombs justified to end the war, or had a new terrifying precedent been set? These questions would dominate international discourse for years to come, influencing policy, warfare, and the collective consciousness of nations worldwide. And so by the evening of August 9th, 1945, Japan had witnessed destruction on a scale unimaginable. 2 cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had been reduced to ruins, their populations decimated, their landscapes altered forever. The survivors faced an uncertain future, navigating the immediate aftermath, while confronting the long-term consequences of radiation, injury, and psychological trauma. The bombs had ended the war swiftly, but at a cost that reverberated far beyond military strategy or political calculations. Humanity had entered a new era, one in which the very instruments of civilization, science, technology, and ingenuity could be turned into engines of annihilation. The moral, political, and existential questions posed by these bombings would shape the post-war world, guiding debates on disarmament, ethics, and the responsibility of wielding such destructive power. And as the sun set over the smouldering ruins of Nagasaki, the people of Japan and the world were left to reckon with the magnitude of what had occurred, the human cost of ambition, and the terrifying potential of the nuclear age. Then, as both cities began to grapple with survival and recovery, the human cost became apparent. not only in numbers but in stories, the individual suffering, the families torn apart, and the generations forever marked by the bomb's legacy. Then, in the days and months that followed, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to tell their stories, revealing the full scope of the human cost. The devastation was no longer confined to the initial explosion. It rippled outward, touching every life in the cities and leaving scars that would endure for generations. In Hiroshima, the streets were filled with the injured and the grieving. Children, many orphaned or separated from their families, wandered in shock through the ruins. Mothers searched desperately for missing children, calling their names into the haze of smoke and ash. Survivors spoke of the heat that had seared their skin, of clothing melting to flesh, of entire blocks of homes disappearing in an instant. The psychological trauma was immense. Many could not comprehend the scale of death, nor the sudden absence of those they loved. Radiation sickness compounded the suffering. Survivors, known as hibakusha, experienced symptoms that were invisible at first: nausea, hair loss, fatigue, and fevers, but quickly worsened. Limbs weakened, gums bled, and internal organs failed. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medical knowledge was limited. Doctors struggled to treat a new and unprecedented form of injury. The long-term consequences became clear only months later, as cancer rates soared and chronic illnesses emerged among those exposed. Children who survived faced stunted growth, infertility, and lifelong health complications. In Nagasaki, the experience mirrored Hiroshima, though the terrain and bomb placement created slightly different patterns of destruction. Families were displaced, neighborhoods destroyed, and cultural landmarks erased. Survivors recounted the deafening roar of the blast, the suffocating heat, and the unrecognizable landscapes that had once been their homes. Entire generations were affected as grandparents, parents, and children perished or suffered lifelong consequences. Communities that had been tight-knit were scattered, leaving social and emotional voids that could not easily be filled. The sheer scale of loss became evident through statistics that failed to capture the human experience. Over 70,000 dead in Hiroshima immediately, tens of thousands more succumbing in the weeks that followed, more than 40,000 dead in Nagasaki instantly, with thousands more dying later from injuries and radiation. Hospitals struggled to cope, temporary shelters overflowed, and aid arrived too slowly to prevent further suffering. Yet behind every number was a story: a child's laughter silenced, a family torn apart, a life cut tragically short. Despite the horrors, acts of courage and compassion emerged. Survivors rescued the wounded, shared limited supplies of water and food, and comforted the dying. Strangers helped one another in streets, choked with rubble and ash, forming temporary communities of survival. Religious leaders held impromptu ceremonies for the dead, and teachers and elders guided children through the trauma, offering what solace they could. The human instinct to protect and help others persisted, even when hope seemed almost impossible to grasp. The psychological impact of the bombings extended far beyond the immediate survivors. Those who lived through the explosions struggled with nightmares, post-traumatic stress, and guilt over the loss of family and neighbors. Some found themselves haunted by memories of shadows burned into walls. of screams in the streets, and of moments of death that they could neither erase nor forget. Communities faced the challenge of rebuilding not only structures but lives and identities, navigating grief while attempting to restore the fabric of daily existence. Internationally, the bombings sparked debate, reflection, and horror. Governments, scientists, and civilians alike grappled with the morality of deploying such destructive power. Could the devastation be justified by the goal of ending the war swiftly? Or had humanity crossed a threshold from which it could never return? The atomic bomb introduced questions that would dominate geopolitics for decades, questions about ethics, deterrence, disarmament, and the responsibility of nations wielding unmatched destructive power. For Japan, the bombings forced a reckoning. Leaders faced an agonizing choice: surrender and hope to preserve what remained of the nation, or continue resistance and risk further annihilation. Civilians grappling with grief and shock understood the stakes on a personal level: the survival of their families, their homes, and their country. The human cost was not only in lives lost, but in the collective trauma of a nation that had witnessed its cities reduced to ashes. Even in the ruins, stories of resilience and survival emerged. Some survivors, despite burns, radiation sickness, or injuries, helped neighbors and strangers alike. Communities organized relief efforts, scavenging for food and water, creating temporary shelters, and attempting to restore basic services. Teachers and elders tried to provide guidance for children who had lost everything, creating small pockets of normalcy amidst chaos. The determination to live, to care for one another, and to rebuild became a testament to human strength, even in the darkest of times. Over time, the hibakusha became living reminders of the human cost of nuclear warfare. They spoke publicly about their experiences, educating others and advocating for peace. Their testimonies revealed the physical and emotional scars left by the bombings, the generational consequences of radiation, and the enduring struggle to reconcile survival with the loss of loved ones. These stories became a central part of global dialogue about nuclear weapons, serving as both warning and plea for humanity to recognize the stakes of technological power. The bombings also reshaped perceptions of war itself. For centuries, conflict had been measured by conventional weapons and battlefield victories. Now, with a single explosion capable of obliterating entire cities, humanity confronted a new reality: the potential for total destruction at the hands of its own creations. The atomic bomb forced policymakers, military strategists, and civilians alike to reconsider the nature of warfare, the ethics of targeting populations, and the limits of human responsibility in the age of nuclear weapons. Cultural, social, and psychological impacts intertwined with the physical devastation. Survivors navigated the loss of cultural landmarks, destruction of homes, and displacement from familiar communities. Religious practices adapted to temporary spaces. Schools and workplaces were re-established under dire conditions. Even as rubble was cleared, the emotional and psychological debris remained, influencing generations and shaping the collective memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the end of 1945, the full human cost was becoming apparent. Tens of thousands dead, countless injured, entire communities destroyed, and a legacy of fear and trauma that would span generations. Survivors struggled to rebuild not only their cities but their lives, confronting grief, illness, and the challenge of imagining a future after unimaginable loss. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, small glimmers of hope persisted. Survivors formed new communities, cared for each other, and began to restore schools, hospitals, and places of worship. Their resilience became a testament to human endurance, a reminder that life, even after total devastation, could continue. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was no longer only a story of destruction. It had become a story of humanity, of survival, and of the moral imperative to understand the consequences of wielding power on an unprecedented scale. And then, as the world absorbed the horror and reflected on the moral and political implications, debates began to emerge, debates that would shape global policy and the nuclear age for decades to come. Then, as the world absorbed the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nations and leaders were forced to confront a new reality. Humanity had entered the nuclear age, and the implications of this unprecedented power were staggering. The use of atomic bombs had ended the Second World War swiftly, but it had also unleashed moral, political, and existential questions that would shape global consciousness for decades. The moral debates were immediate and intense. Across the globe, philosophers, scientists, journalists, and ordinary citizens grappled with the question, was the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? Advocates of the bomb argued that it had saved millions of lives by preventing a prolonged invasion of Japan, hastening the end of the war, and demonstrating overwhelming military strength. Critics countered that targeting civilian populations was inherently immoral, a violation of human rights, and an act that could never be justified under any circumstances. The images of charred bodies, shadowed streets, and suffering survivors became central to the discourse, forcing humanity to confront the human cost of technological power. In the United States, debates emerged not only in public forums, but also among scientists and military officials who had developed the bomb. Robert Oppenheimer, often called the father of the atomic bomb, famously reflected on the implications of his creation, quoting from sacred texts and expressing profound ambivalence. Many who had worked on the Manhattan Project wrestled with feelings of responsibility, guilt, and the realization that their scientific achievements had opened the door to destruction on an unprecedented scale. Japan faced its own moral reckoning. Leaders already devastated by the loss of life and infrastructure had to consider surrender to an enemy wielding unmatched destructive power. Civilians grappling with grief, injury, and displacement also faced a moral dimension: how to rebuild lives after witnessing the annihilation of entire cities. Communities were left to navigate not only physical reconstruction, but the psychological challenge of survival in a world where technology could obliterate their homes in an instant. The political ramifications were equally profound. The bombings demonstrated the United States' technological and military superiority, positioning it as a dominant global power in the post-war order. The Soviet Union, having entered the war against Japan late but observing the devastation, recognized the need to accelerate its own nuclear program, setting the stage for an arms race that would define international relations for decades. Nations worldwide understood that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Nuclear weapons were now central to military strategy, diplomacy, and global politics. At the United Nations, formed in 1945 to promote international cooperation and prevent future wars, discussions began on how to regulate the use of nuclear weapons. Countries debated treaties, inspections and controls, but the scale and secrecy of the Manhattan Project revealed the difficulty of monitoring such technology. The challenge was not only technical but philosophical. How could humanity prevent itself from repeating the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while simultaneously developing technology that could promise progress, energy, and scientific advancement? The bombings also sparked reflection on the human relationship with technology. For centuries, humans had created tools to shape their environment, defend their nations, and improve quality of life. The atomic bomb represented a terrifying inversion, technology capable of annihilating cities, populations, and entire civilizations. The question became not whether technology could be used, but whether humanity was prepared to wield it responsibly. The implications extended beyond military strategy to ethics, education, and international cooperation, demanding a global conversation about power, responsibility, and survival. Survivor testimonies played a central role in this dialogue. Hibakusha, those who survived the atomic bombings, traveled internationally to share their experiences, humanizing the statistics and putting faces to the moral dilemmas of nuclear warfare. They described in detail the immediate effects of the bombs, the long-term health consequences, and the psychological trauma that persisted for decades. Their voices became a moral compass for the world, advocating for disarmament, peace, and ethical reflection in the nuclear age. The global political landscape began to shift in response. The United States emerged as a superpower, with nuclear capabilities central to its foreign policy. The Soviet Union accelerated its own nuclear program, culminating in the first Soviet atomic bomb in 1949. Countries aligned themselves with one superpower or another, often guided by the implicit threat of nuclear retaliation. The doctrine of deterrence emerged. Peace, paradoxically, was maintained through the mutual threat of destruction, a fragile equilibrium that would dominate the Cold War era. Economically and socially, the atomic age reshaped nations. Massive investments were made in nuclear research, infrastructure, and energy programs. Scientific and engineering disciplines expanded rapidly, driven by both military and civilian applications of atomic technology. Cities rebuilt from war damage incorporated lessons from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, designing civil defense measures, shelters, and evacuation plans. The psychological imprint of the bombings extended to education, culture, and public consciousness, shaping how populations understood risk, survival, and technological responsibility. The bombings also altered international law and ethical standards regarding warfare. The targeting of civilians and the unprecedented scale of destruction challenged pre-existing conventions. Subsequent treaties, conventions, and global discussions on war crimes, humanitarian law, and the use of weapons of mass destruction were influenced directly by the moral questions raised by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb had not only ended a war, but had introduced a new dimension to human accountability and conflict. Culturally, the bombings inspired literature, art, film, and philosophy. Writers and filmmakers explored the trauma, moral ambiguity, and existential questions posed by nuclear weapons. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols in global consciousness, representing both the fragility of life and the ethical dilemmas inherent in human advancement. Memorials, museums, and annual commemorations emerged, ensuring that the lessons of these cities were remembered and transmitted to future generations. By the late 1940s, the world had entered a period of cautious reflection and anxious preparation. The bombs had demonstrated the potential for both ultimate destruction and ultimate deterrence. Nations sought to harness nuclear energy for civilian purposes, while simultaneously guarding against the existential threat posed by weapons capable of ending entire populations in minutes. The shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki loomed over every diplomatic negotiation, every military decision, and every scientific breakthrough. The human cost, moral reckoning, and geopolitical consequences were intertwined. The bombings had demonstrated that technology could not be divorced from ethics. The political landscape had shifted irrevocably, forcing nations to balance power with responsibility. The lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became foundational for understanding the risks of nuclear proliferation, the fragility of peace, and the moral weight of scientific achievement. And then, as nations grappled with these realities, the world moved forward into a new era, one defined not only by technological possibility, but by the ever-present risk of annihilation. A reminder that humanity's choices could determine whether life flourished or was extinguished on an unprecedented scale. Then, in the decades that followed, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shaped global consciousness, peace movements, and the ongoing dialogue about human responsibility. The immediate destruction was only the beginning. The long-term consequences, physical, psychological, and cultural, would resonate for generations, serving as both warning and testament to human endurance. Survivors, or hibakusha, became living symbols of resilience and caution. They shared stories of loss, suffering, and survival, detailing the physical injuries, the radiation sickness, and the psychological scars that never fully healed. Their testimonies traveled across borders, appearing in schools, international conferences, and public forums. Through these accounts, the world was forced to confront the human dimension behind the statistics, recognizing that the power of the atomic bomb was not an abstract concept, but a tangible force that left thousands of lives irrevocably changed. Memorials and museums arose in both cities, dedicated to remembrance and education. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, commonly known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, stands as a haunting silhouette of a city frozen in the moment of devastation. Plaques, statues, and exhibitions document individual stories and collective suffering, ensuring that the experiences of the bombings are neither forgotten nor repeated. Annual ceremonies commemorate the victims, bringing together survivors, families, politicians, and citizens from around the world to honor lives lost and reaffirm commitments to peace. Globally, Hiroshima and Nagasaki catalyzed movements for nuclear disarmament and international cooperation. Organizations formed to advocate for the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, emphasizing the moral and ethical imperatives highlighted by the bombings. Conferences, treaties, and negotiations sought to prevent the recurrence of such catastrophic destruction, recognizing that the stakes had shifted from regional conflict to potential global annihilation. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, signed in 1968, became a cornerstone of international efforts to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. Rooted in the lessons learned from the bombings of Japan, culturally, the atomic bombings influenced art, literature, film, and philosophy worldwide. Writers explored themes of existential dread, moral responsibility, and the fragility of civilization. Filmmakers depicted the immediate horrors and long-term consequences of nuclear warfare, embedding the events into collective consciousness. Visual arts, poetry, and novels reflected both grief and hope, translating human suffering into mediums that transcended language and borders. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of humanity's capacity for destruction and the ethical obligations that accompany technological power. Educational programs incorporated survivor accounts, scientific analysis, and historical context, teaching new generations about the devastating consequences of nuclear weapons. Schools in Japan and around the world emphasized the importance of peace, empathy, and critical reflection on the use of technology. Students learned not only about the mechanics of the bombs and the strategies of wartime decision-makers, but also about the human stories, the lives cut short, families destroyed, and communities irreparably altered. The psychological legacy was profound. Survivors faced lifelong trauma, grappling with grief, survivors' guilt, and the challenges of rebuilding shattered lives. Communities that had once been vibrant and interconnected struggled to restore social cohesion, while future generations inherited the emotional weight of history. Counseling, support networks, and advocacy groups emerged, providing assistance and fostering resilience in the face of ongoing physical and mental health challenges. Internationally, the bombings left an indelible mark on diplomacy and military strategy. The Cold War, with its doctrine of mutually assured destruction, was shaped by the knowledge of what nuclear weapons could achieve. Political leaders, strategists, and policymakers had to navigate a world where cities could be obliterated in minutes, where entire populations could be threatened by technological power, and where decisions carried unprecedented moral weight. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became reference points for ethical decision-making, deterrence strategies, and global security policies. At the same time, the bombings sparked introspection about humanity's relationship with science and technology. The same ingenuity that had led to rapid industrialization, medical advances, and space exploration also created weapons capable of annihilation. Philosophers, ethicists, and scientists debated the responsibilities that accompanied such power. Could knowledge be separated from morality? Could technological progress exist without ethical oversight? These questions, raised in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, continue to resonate in discussions about artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and other transformative technologies today. Rebuilding Hiroshima and Nagasaki was both a physical and symbolic act. Cities were reconstructed with modern infrastructure, parks and memorials, yet they retained the memory of their past. Families returned, businesses reopened, and schools and hospitals were rebuilt, yet the scars remained visible in the cityscape and in the collective memory of the inhabitant. The act of reconstruction itself became a statement of resilience. Life continues, even in the shadow of unimaginable destruction. The lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki extend beyond Japan. They serve as reminders to all humanity that power carries responsibility, that the pursuit of strategic advantage must be balanced by ethical reflection, and that technology, while a tool for progress, can become an instrument of catastrophe if misused. The bombings illustrate the stakes of human ambition and the profound consequences of decisions made in moments of political, military, or scientific calculation. Today, the world continues to wrestle with these lessons. Nations maintain arsenals capable of mass destruction, yet treaties, diplomacy, and advocacy work to prevent the repetition of history. Peace movements, educational programs, and survivor testimonies emphasize the importance of empathy, reflection, and restraint. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a cautionary tale, urging humanity to consider not only what it can achieve, but what it should achieve, reminding us that moral responsibility must accompany every step forward. As the sun sets over modern Hiroshima and Nagasaki, memorials bathe in the fading light, a silent testament to lives lost, suffering endured, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Children play where streets were once consumed by fire, families gather in rebuilt homes, and communities thrive amidst reminders of the past. Yet the memory remains vivid, a constant reminder that the choices of yesterday continue to shape the moral, political, and ethical landscape of today. And so, the atomic bombings of August 1945 stand as a watershed moment in human history. They ended a war, demonstrated the terrifying power of science, and forced humanity to confront its capacity for both destruction and resilience. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, once reduced to ruins, now serve as enduring symbols of the horrors of unchecked technological power, of the moral imperatives that arise from such power, and of the human will to survive, rebuild, and strive for peace. The story concludes not with a simple ending, but with reflection. The scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not merely in the past, they remain in our collective memory, guiding how we think about war, peace, and the responsibilities of our own technology. Humanity was forever changed in those August days of 1945, and the echoes of that change continue to resonate across time and generations. And then, as we remember the lives lost, the suffering endured, and the resilience displayed, the ultimate lesson remains clear: power without conscience can destroy, but humanity's capacity for reflection, compassion, and rebuilding can define the path forward, ensuring that such devastation is never repeated.